So this is essentially a presentation that I realized also for other people that ask me about this data, and contains most and probably a little bit more information that I tried to condensate inside the post that, of course, is visible completely free of charge on our website on Tochnyi. And this is the results of a research that I'm currently doing using the observed strike that we can collect from different sources, including videos that now start to also appear on YouTube, but mainly from Telegram. And it's done with the incredible help of Andrew and Geek, but also the rest of the team. Before I continue, I want to say that this study is capped on March 2024, and the reason is because I worked actively on this database until that date. Then I had to take a break, and now I'm starting again to help Andrew. So once I feel confident of everything, I will post a very large and probably important update on what's going on in the last 3 months. But the study is essentially still representative because, as you can see in the first slide, I decided to analyze the effectiveness or tried to determine the effect of FPV drone strikes on tanks. Now, this was moved essentially by the continuous discussion about the fact that many people believe that drones are used mainly to finish a tank or an armored vehicle, which is true. A lot of time this is true, but I tried to put some numbers and some statistics behind. So in this slide, you can see essentially all the tanks that have been tracked in the database until March, and these have been divided in three large categories: damaged tanks, abandoned, and totally destroyed. Now, defining a damaged tank is very, very difficult, and the reason is because sometimes the video cuts immediately after the strike, so you don't have a lot of information, and other times essentially there is a damage. You can but you cannot understand if the crew is still alive unless there is of course a catastrophic failure. Catastrophic failure essentially means the cook off of the ammunition, so all the total destroyed tank are essentially tanks that experience turret toss or an explosion or significant damage. Instead, abandon when essentially the crew physically abandon the vehicle and damage everything else. It's true that if you look at some of the videos that regards damaged tank, you may see seriously damaged tanks. So tanks that probably are good only for as scrap metal or for parts. I didn't went to this level of details because otherwise we would not produce a very reliable statistics. So as you can see, there was a period of a stationary period until December, and then we have this increase in number of tanks attacked by FPV. Of course, these represent only the portion that we see, but these this is very much in line with the activity that we have seen on the battlefield through the geolocalization of the data, but also thanks to other figures. And in particular, this still not updated. I mean, it's updated up to March, but as you can see, this is graphs about BMPs, BTRs, and MTLBs. And you can see that there is a large variation, but BMPs are essentially following the same trend of tanks because they were used in conjunction with tanks, especially in the Adivka offensive. And at the same point, you can see that also BTR and MTLBs have been heavily affected. In particularly MTLBs, they are nearly 50%, no, a bit less than 50% damage and abandoned respect to the destroyed part. So
just real quick, Daniele. So BTR, we're going to just call an infantry fighting vehicle. I'm just making sure people understand the terms we're using. And then an MBLT as a main battle tank, like a regular?
No.
Go ahead.
So
Sorry.
the BMP is an infantry fight vehicle. In BMP, I put every BMP model, so from 1 to 2 to 3, and any variant, because otherwise it would be impossible to build like a plot. You would have class with one only attacked. So it's an infantry fight vehicle. BTR and MTLBs goes into the APC category. So essentially, if you want a parallel with with Western, an M113 essentially is an armored vehicle, but it cannot withstand more than probably even less than a 12 millimeter machine gun. So are likely armored vehicle. And they have been used more and more to essentially support BMPs, because after Adivka, essentially the Russian army discovered that by committing so many armored vehicles and especially BMPs to the war effort, they essentially start to have problems in fielding new vehicles and to sustain their armored assault. So they have to move to improvised vehicle or BTR of MTLBs, which are very old vehicles. So this trend is essentially confirmed by then the appearance of the turtle tank, because the turtle tank essentially, as we will see, is an attempt to deploy an armored vehicle that was able to transport a lot of personnel to the front line. Now, in terms of attrition, in terms of also on financial attrition, this is very difficult and complex and still an experiment. What I have done, I have took an average cost for BMP and different T series tank, and then I consider that any tank abandoned or destroyed, and the same for BMPs, you take away the entire cost of the tank, and for a damage 50%. Now, this I know that doesn't make much sense because, of course, some damaged tanks are not recovered, and so this means that they are completely lost. So this loss is much higher than 50%. But I wanted to give like a kind of weight to don't essentially consider everything at the same in the same way, and also because it's always difficult to say if a tank or a BMP or whatever vehicle was recovered after. We know that this doesn't happen always. There are rumors that say that, but again, these are rumors. Like people say, oh, we have a source that say that this 30% of the vehicle damage are recovered, but there is no proof about that. So it's just a rumor. And so you can see that the total cost only in terms of tank is nearly 1.5 billion in less than 7 months. Of course, this number is not huge, but you have to take into account the fact that these are old vehicles, so they are not newly produced, so some were just in store. So it's more the number of the vehicle that have been taken out rather than the actual cost, but still a very big chunk of money, because you have to consider that these are average of the observed. So the number probably is larger than what we see here. And then the second part of the study regarded the trying to understand which tank was mostly affected by these strikes. And as you can see, this essentially reflect the reality on the battlefield. The series 72, 80, and 90 are the mainly deployed, with the T80 being probably the best tank of the three, and have been used much more. In fact, has a higher number of hit, and which resulted in a damage. And I want to underline that these are these numbers are a bit lower than the very first graph, and the reason is because it's not always possible for us to give the type of tank from the video, because sometimes the video is so low quality that you can just see the barrel, understand that it's a tank, but you cannot distinguish between which model is. So you classify as a Russian tank, and that's it. So these are tanks that we identified categorized as damaged, destroyed, or abandoned, and then in some cases also geolocated. And from here, I decide to concentrate on T72. And the question that I want to answer once for all was, does tanks have, does the FPV drone attack tanks only when they are in a stationary position or abandoned or anyway in any way acting? And this is returned to be false, because essentially you can see by the graph that in red we have damage on tanks while they were stationary, and in the green when they were moving. And apart from some discrepancy, for example, in October and November, the other times is essentially 50-50. And in fact, what you can see also in the other categories for the T80 and T90s, which I'm preparing for an update later on, this is more or less unchanged. So it really depends by the situation. And honestly, this is also obvious by the capabilities on an FPV drone. An FPV drone has a level of agility in terms of maneuver that it can perform, and of speed that can overtake a tank. So even if the tank is moving, there is no reason why an FPV should not take a hit. And in fact, when it's necessary, it does, even in combat. I've seen a lot of drone footage while the T-72 was firing on a tree line, probably occupied by Ukrainian defenders, and the FPV drones goes over the tank, over it, and then strike on the back. So while he was firing and moving. So this is just to underline that this is not true. I mean, a tank can be taken out by an FPV drone while moving, and sometimes what happens is that the tank is not completely destroyed, and after a drone drop attack take place in order to finish the tank if the tank cannot be recovered by the defenders. I don't know if there is any question, or I can continue.
I guess like the previous figure just kind of interests me, the ratios a bit, like just the high number of T80s and T90s is kind of interesting to me. I always assumed the T72 was really like a much more, I don't know, like that was the dominant tank on the battlefield. But it seems like there's, I don't know, a lot of T80s and a decent, like there's a third of the T90 strikes as there are T72. So there's a lot more T90s out there than I guess I presumed. And a lot fewer of the older models like the T55 and T62, et cetera. But maybe that's a video bias. There's a lot of other explanations for that, but just in terms of these figures, that kind of stood out to me. Sorry, go ahead, Daniel.
Yeah, no, I think that there is also a target of opportunity, because for a drone operator is also very rewarding in terms of career, but also in terms of actual mission planning, that hitting a high value target with a drone that is 500 pounds against a few millions of a T90 or a T80, which is a very effective tank, the T80, is much more important. Then there is also of course, this is the only what we observe, so still debatable. But there is also another reason about that, and is the fact that there are also other means by which these tanks are taken out. ATGM, not a lot of other tank, because tank over tank is not very common. So the point is that I expected these three to be the most affected, and again, it may be that the T72 has more videos that we don't see and bring a little bit higher. So, but what really makes me thinking that there is some trend is also the destroyed. I mean, if you look at the T72 and T80, you can see that T72 is a bit more affected by FPV drones, which makes a bit sense, and we will see why this, because it's a holder tank, has much less protection despite the cages and etc. So the T8 is still a better tank than the T72. So, but again, this has to be taken with a grain of salt of the fact that we see only what we can observe. It's not the entire story. And of course, with the further data of the following months, we may see T90 going up or T-72 explode, we don't know. But is a good way to start the next part of the research, which was trying to understand, first of all, in terms of mobility, if the improved maneuverability of an FPV drone could have an impact on these. And the answer is yes, but depends by the situation on the ground, because FPV drone pilot can act on pre-planned missions, so they know that there is a target that they have to hit, or they are called, as I saw in some videos, they are called to defend position, so they have to strike attacking enemies. So it really depends. And this essentially is a way to say, no, it's not true that they attack only stationary objective. It really depends by what's going on the battlefield. And then this brings me to the another important topic about where they hit. And this start to become something, because I start to see a pattern in the way of attacking. We know from probably common knowledge, video games, books, films, that there are some areas of attack that are let's say more vulnerable, and we know that the back of a tank and the top of a tank is much more vulnerable rather than the front. But during these analysis of the video to understand if they were attacking tanks that were moving or not, I start to see a pattern. And this pattern essentially was confirmed by the fact that the back was much more affected. You can see FPV drone attacking from the front, I mean, approaching even from the front a tank, passing it, and then going back in order to attack, of course, on the back. But what was very interesting was the turret and rear hull attack. So it's this region between the turret and the engine compartment. And by looking at different videos, what I immediately understood is that the FPV drone tends to approach with a certain angle of attack the tank, and then just before hitting, it tilts the drone before striking and before essentially activating the warhead. And this was done in exactly all the videos of attack on this region. This is the region that I showed you before, which is just after the grating of the engine compartment. And the reason is you can see also video here. It's not graphic, so you can see. Let me disable the video. You can see that he even do this stop, and then this essentially brings immediately to the ignition of the ammunition compartment. And this is a maneuver that drone pilot probably have to have practiced with the time and also in their school, because it's done essentially every time, and this is very effective. And essentially the main reason is because this is like a drawing of a T-72, and the region that they attacked is this one, which has a very tiny layer of armor, and then underneath there is the ammunition compartment. So the reason why they attack this area is because they need to pierce the armor where it is weaker, and also this has a likelihood to ignite the ammunition stored inside, provoking a catastrophic failure or a very serious damage. Now, this is of course something that is not new. There were a lot of warhead developed into the past in terms of ATGM, where the preformed shaped charge were inclined in order to allow and to maximize the penetration of the charge against the armor of the tank. So this is essentially an adaptation of a very simple warhead, normally an RPG on a hit round, in this environment. And this brings us to the turtle tank, because as you can see, the main reason why the turtle tank has been generated is related to also these phenomena. So the Russian tried and failed I anticipate the end of all this effort, to first of all deploy some kind of vehicle that was able to host infantry inside this structure, protect them somehow, but also protect the tank from FPV drone, because their belief was adding a layer of protection would deter the effectiveness of the FPV drones against the more vulnerable armor of the tank. Now, this is of course immediately returned to be not very effective, because and this is one of the cases that I saw where, and this was quite early stage when the turtle tank was coming out, so even the Ukrainians were a bit confused on what to do with this type of threat. This was taken down with the 3 FPV drone, and you can argue, okay, maybe this amount of money for essentially a T-72 with some sheet of metal is not a lot, but still you have to consider also that the Russian had to put manpower and effort to build these things and not doing other tasks. And in this particular case, the FPV drone operator strikes 3 times, 2 times on the side of the armor without producing much effect. And then the third one is on a track, the tank stop, and then it finished essentially. The crew have to disembark and escape. So essentially, turtle tank, as we have seen even recently, have been captured. They are not a threat for several reasons. The first and probably the most important is that their mobility is so low that they are even more exposed to FPV drone. The fact that they put on the top EW can work, but we know that once you understand what type of EW the enemy is using, you can adapt to that. And in fact, there have been some success in doing this. And last but not least, you lose all the advantages of having a tank, because you cannot traverse your turret, you cannot fight effectively. So it's really not effective on the battlefield. Of course, at the beginning, it produced fear, of course, and many even not very experienced journalists start to say, "Oh, this is the adaptation of the Russian army." I see more the desperation of an army that has a threat that cannot fight back. On the completely different point, the Ukrainians have done a magnificent job in modifying, for example, the Abrams with a technique of creating gradings and adding protection in a very effective way without limiting the ability of the tank of traversing and using its gun, using its sensor. So it's a better approach, honestly. And this is just last slide before concluding about tank destruction and where they've been located. This was around Adivka at the time of the offensive, and you can see that they have been taken out. These were all moving. They've been taken out mainly on streets, and of course also in the fields. And the reason is because normally they try always to use roads to move faster, but then when they are essentially stopped by FPV or other threats, they try to use the terrain surrounding the streets in order to advance and take some cover. But in these cases, essentially, they were all taken out. Most of these were destroyed, others were abandoned in this particular case. So, as a conclusion, we can say that, of course, FPV drones confirms to be an effective weapon in the sense that for the price tag that you have, you can deploy a lot of them, more than what we see in these stats. And if used properly in conjunction with other systems on the battlefield, they can be very effective and very dangerous. And they can even lead your adversary to use very goofy solution like the turtle tank in order to protect from it. Of course, in the future, I don't predict that they will dominate completely the battlefield, because there will be more refined solution like trophy-like systems, more EW, counter drones, and also counter pilot operation, because you can locate pilot and take them down, and then essentially the drone cannot operate. And and that's essentially everything.
Thank you, Daniela. It was a lot of very interesting information. Yeah, I think I learned a lot. Does anyone on the panel have any questions for Daniela?
Well, maybe more like a comment. I think what the conclusion of Daniela's research, and especially the fact that they are aiming for specific parts of the tank very methodically. I think this shows that Ukraine has achieved to create not just doctrines but also highly sophisticated tactics and training programs for drone pilots. And I think that's people might have been joking about the fact that Ukraine said we're going to create an army of drones and drone pilots, but they are really actually succeeding in it. And there's also a lot of other observations that I've done that confirms that they're using similar tactics, or not just similar, but very, very doctrinal tactics in many different brigades, which kind of leads me to conclude that this has been decided on a higher level. How to employ drones and what techniques and tactics to use.
I totally agree. And there is also another important point to say that drones in general and have been probably the system that saved Ukraine in the winter and during the Adivka offensive, because lack of manpower, lack of ammunition forced them to accelerate and to try to put a patch on a problem. And now people are also very much willing to operate a drone. And operating a drone is not only reconnaissance, it's also a kinetic operation. So there is also value in applying for these type of jobs in the army. So I think for them is also a way to attract people to say, okay, you don't want to be essentially assaulting a trench, but you can still doing your part by operating drones. And they remember there have been some I think United 24, but there were a lot of interviews, also independent journalists that went with the FPV pilots. They do a very important job and also very close to the front line. I mean, because it's true that the range of these drones is very quite substantial, but they still need a kind of line of sight, so their antennas should look at the position, I mean, at the drone, so they need to be close to the action, and so there's still a danger, but still probably perceived less dangerous than assaulting a trench. So it's also important, I think, in that regards, because when you have less people as basics, because I mean there are less, the population is smaller than the Russian one, and you still training that critical mass, having people that can have an effect on the battlefield by using this type of munition and system is very important, I think.
Yeah, and one thing that I heard many times in Ukraine was also that whenever drones were discussed with Ukrainians, they often say like, "This is how we can save Ukrainian lives, because the drone can do a lot of the things that you normally would use a person to do, and in many of those cases, it's just way too dangerous, or it will basically risk someone's life or sacrifice them to do the same task as the drone does, and they are absolutely necessary tasks. So if they didn't have the drones, then a lot more Ukrainians would die. So they say that the drones save lives. So buying more drones or funding more drones saves Ukrainian lives. That was like a unison message I heard, exactly the same, said the same way from many Ukrainians.
But yeah, I mean, drones as and robots in general, even in manufacturing industries or in normal jobs, are used not not to steal people's job, but to avoid to humans to do very dangerous or heavy task that can injure them even in the long term. So it's completely correct what they are doing.
But on the other hand, they are also very, very dangerous, and you see the Russians trying to mimic and copy the Ukrainians in all the different drone tech. I'm quite certain they don't do it as well in most of the areas, but as you talked about before, with FPV drones, Russian FPV drones has been really, really deadly for Ukraine as well,
especially on trenches. Yes, and I think that there is and still these chase. So they are chasing them each other. From what I see and a bit of gut feeling, also on the way on how the industry in Ukraine, both professional and volunteer, which still professional, like Wild Hornet, the approach, it's better. It's more sustainable in terms of mass production. Russia still having a lot of different design, and they still not have decided which is their path. So they essentially rely on so many alternatives that are produced in small batches, and they need to be tested. So they test everything and then they do a little step. So this is of course, and then there is also the central government that want to control everything. So these also hamper the capability of innovation, which is a very big problem in these type of programs. But they are not stupid. They have intelligent people that can solve their problem and can develop this system, of course. I think that what Ukraine has as an advantage is also the electronic part, because the Russians have never been very, very good in advanced electronics and essentially nanotechnology to produce MEMS and so accelerometer and other things, and they need to rely on China. So that's the big question mark. So if they receive proper help, they can close that gap much quicker than expected. So my hope is that they're still, of course, chasing. For example, the 3D printing of ammunition. At the beginning, they have done nearly nothing. Now, every day you can see new types coming out. Some are very similar to Ukraine, some are completely different. So, of course, they learn and they try to reapply. So, it's a race, and it will end with the end of the war, probably.
I wanted to ask you guys about there were some comments made by a French Army Chief of Staff General, Pierre Schill, at the Eurostatory Defense Show in Paris. This is a defense show that happened, I want to say last week. June 19th was when it happened. And this was like a big like defense expo for a lot of major Western European militaries, as far as I understand. There was like a little, I didn't mention it in the news because it just wasn't like related enough to Ukraine, but there was like a little bit of Ukraine stuff going on there. So I read a little bit about it at the time. Anyway, he was speaking at that event, and he basically said that these drones, these FPV drones in particular, are enjoying, and I'm just going to use as many quotes from him as I can here to let you guys react to them. It's, quote, a moment in history. And he said that anti-drone systems are lagging. They leave the sky open to things that are cobbled together, but which are extremely fragile. And he says the life of impunity is small. Very simple drones over the battlefield is a snapshot in time. Right now it's being exploited. That's clear. We have to protect ourselves. Today, the sword in that sense, as in terms of the drone, is powerful, more powerful than the shield, but the shield is going to grow. And I want to say that's basically the bulk of his comments. So yeah, do you guys have any thoughts on that? Do you broadly agree? Do you think he gets some things right and some things wrong, or how would you react to that?
Well, I mean, that's the eternal race between who developed the gun and who developed the vest. You always say, oh, I have this new caliber that can penetrate your armor, and then you have to improve, and then we are back to square zero. So I mean, in general sense, he didn't say anything special, and I think it's also true that the system that we currently see today, tomorrow will be of course, surpassed. I mean, think about the first use of aircraft during the First World War. Look how much they evolved since then. The second exploded. So I mean, yes, of course, today's battleground is today battleground and cannot be transported in 20, 30 years ahead. But for sure, there are lessons learned here to be understood. First of all, that very expensive drones can have a role, especially, I mean, loitering munition, and Erland probably knows what I'm talking about, but need to be considered, respect the type of scenario that you have. For example, a very expensive drone that can do multiple tasks and have a very expensive sensor system can be useful when you can't transport a lot of these, for example, in a littoral campaign. But it's completely fool to do this exactly in the same way in a continental campaign, like a war in Europe, because your supply chain can provide you dozen and dozen of these drones. So why? And you may have different system to do different tasks. Why you want to overprice and overcomplicate a system that should be easy and cheap, or at least the cheapest possible in order to do the proper task. So I kind of agree, but I think is also what he said is a bit like this stuff is not going to survive this war. We will do better. Hopefully yes, but I have my doubt, because I think industry have to change a lot, and we will have to change how we fight wars. This is clear, and not because of FPV, because the presence of drone, because of the distributed presence of sensor on the battlefield, which is essentially something that we envision partially with F-35s and all these multi-domain things, where you have essentially each tank, MRAP, IFV, any vehicle have its own sensor and communicate. Now expand this to a power N, because you have dozens of drones flying over you. Everything will change. Sorry, Erland, I know that you have much more.
No, but very well said. And I think there's a lot of experts that look at this and they don't see enough of the information to be able to give a good reasoning and conclusion to what is going to happen, or prediction. And I honestly, like, I don't want to say that I'm an expert or anything, but I've at least been able to observe an enormous amount of material and talk to some people that are very heavily involved with drone warfare on the ground in Ukraine and developing drones as well. And from what I can observe, there is absolutely no chance that even with Western technology and industry, we will be able to um, to find a solution to this problem easily. We can probably mitigate it a lot, and Ukraine and Russia are trying as best as they can, but there are again and again proof and evidence that there is no easy way to get rid of this problem. The first kind of signs that massive amount of surveillance drones was really difficult to handle was that the Ukrainians were able to fly small UAVs far behind the enemy lines and strike Russian targets with gimbalers and artillery strikes. And then this is now, changed into a much bigger domain where you have smaller quadcopters, both delivering munitions and also gathering ISR information for both sides. And none of the sides are able to completely disrupt the enemy ISR drones or the FPV drones. We can see that in isolated areas, Ukraine has been a lot more successful to suppress the enemy's capacities, but not 100%. For instance, Magyar's birds are very, very good at certain electronic warfare measures, but still they're not completely protected from Russian drones. And I just don't see that the West is first of all trying and taking it seriously enough to learn from the Ukrainian experience, that we will be able to kind of find a solution that will kind of put an end to this problem. And I think we have serious lack of understanding in the West to how to defeat this, and also how to employ these tactics on the battlefield. Because if we don't embrace this, then the enemy will have an advantage over us, because they will be able to.
Yeah, I agree. I think I kind of am reading kind of two threads here that are both kind of interesting to me. The one, I think I agree with you, Erlen, that this speech by this French guy still indicates to me a somewhat cavalier attitude about drones. I'm not suggesting that it's an entirely unfounded attitude. Like a lot of smart people, I would argue John Ridge, our Tochnyi contributor, famously smarter than me, would have some variation of this argument, this moment in time argument, we'll call it, right? That the FPV drone is dominant on the battlefield in Ukraine right now. I would say this camp of expert doesn't deny that, but they would argue that this is a moment in history that's based on a particular set of circumstances in this particular war that maybe don't map out accurately to like the future of war. And I think you and I are in a different camp. They're like, no, this is serious. But so that's number one. I would say that his comments come off as someone maybe still being a bit cavalier about that, and potentially also he is at a defense expo. There's a bunch of anti-drone equipment being sold there. The guy's probably trying to sell some anti-drone systems for the people that paid him to go speak there. Let's be real, right? But I think Daniele had another thread that's also very interesting, which is like Western militaries, maybe they can't get their heads around this drone problem, right? Which is like, infuriating and frustrating, but somewhat understandable. But what they do need to get their heads around, and like they can't get away from, and I think they are trying to grapple with to some degree, is like, as Daniel said, there is a proliferation of more sensors on the battlefield, and that means like the information flow and the bandwidth, and also there's just a proliferation of like systems that autonomy, right? Like systems that are more autonomous, and things that used to require humans won't require humans as much. And maybe we don't need to call that drones necessarily, but like that is a reality that isn't going away. Like Ukraine has the most sensors on the battlefield that we've ever seen. Probably the next war that the West is involved in will have even more than that, right? So that's something we need to take into account. And I think this autonomy aspect, like whether we want to call them drones or whatever, it doesn't have to be drones, but that the battlefields will become more autonomous, that less human input will be required to accomplish the same tasks that were in the past. So I think those are both kind of interesting threads. And I think that militaries around the world should deal with both, but at a bare minimum, they're going to have to grapple with the thing that Daniele mentioned, this autonomy and sensors.
The problem, I think, is that we're not prepared for the masses of drones, because we can probably, most likely, I'm quite confident we can defeat most drones and suppress drone warfare in limited areas of operation with the technology that we already have. We just need to learn more about how the drones operate and work. But the problem here is that we're not learning enough from the Ukrainians, because we don't see how massive of this like the scale issue, I think, is really, really the problem here. So yes, there are ways to defeat the drones, but the scale of it is hard for me to understand how any European or Western country is going to transition their armies into this counter UAS roles enough to be able to handle the problem, if that makes sense. There is also a lot of things that are happening in Ukraine that it seems that a lot of the experts, or so-called experts, they probably are expert in their fields, but it seems that like they don't see enough of the information that is being even published and shown and that they don't really grasp how fast the development of these drones has been in Ukraine, and also how they're being employed. And the differences between different drone systems seems to be kind of lost in translation for a lot of people. And what worries me is that a lot of these people are being used as references to governments taking major decisions. That is a big worry for me. Because I do think we can fix it somehow, but it's going to be a continuous, cat and mouse game. And in the next conflict, I'm certain that there's going to be a new cat and mouse race in this, just like we see in Ukraine now.
Yeah, I would agree. Even for the optimists, it seems like it's a good idea to do more research into the field in general. I think that's like I think no one can argue that. Go ahead, Daniele. Sorry.
Oh, no worries. I just wanted to say something salty regarding Eurosatori 2024. You know which type of weapon system was essentially back and in mass to the venue? Self-propelled anti-air guns and 30 millimeter autocannon everywhere, because they are trying to patch these with what we had in the past. Because another problem of drones is the fact that you can use also in a way to saturate your air defense system, and we have seen the terrible effect of these in this conflict, with Russians using Shahed mainly as a sacrificial suicidal mission in order to hamper the missile stocks of Ukraine air defenses. And we have seen what this resulted after. And so, I mean, the problem is big, because the previous, even only for this aspect, our air defense system is not prepared. Today, our defense system rely on the fact that we have enough plane and enough missile to counter the same threat. But if we have someone that want to saturate our air defense system, we have very little, because I mean, Gepard probably in Europe is the only type of weapon system that can counter these things without using a missile. So again, it's true, we have the technology, but technology and engineering skill need to be backed by politicians and money and investment. And this is what Ireland is and even myself, we are very scared of, because underestimating now today this threat is going to play very, very bad when if we are going to face with another much more prepared opponent, China.
The thing is that there is no one fix for this problem, right? You see Ukraine
Totally agree.
That's kind of the one of the big issues here. It seems like some governments are going for one solution to counter drones, others are going for another, and that's not how we're going to be able to defend against this. And I know Gao is shouting about Skynex, and yes, it's a fantastic system, but you need it just in Ukraine. You probably need like 10,000 of them to cover the front lines, and not probably something would get through. That's totally unrealistic.
No, I just pointed it out because Daniele said that the Gepard is the only solution currently
Gepard.
which doesn't get use missiles for it, and I just said, hey, there's also Skyranger and Skynex. It wasn't about Skynex being the perfect solution for everything.
Yeah, but the thing is that these systems are great. It's just that there's no future where we'll have enough of them.
Yeah, that was my main. I was thinking exactly that. I mean, Gepard essentially we can say that is the grandpa of Skyranger and Skynex, but is only a solution provided by one country, or we start to produce in each country. We license these, but otherwise we will never have enough. And as Erlen said, kinetic solution from a gun system is only one part. You need probably a lot of alternative in order to create like an onion of protection against against drones. So
yes, to be honest, we're never going to be able to 100% defend against it, in my opinion. But what we probably will be able to is to create quite safe and secure umbrellas around certain tactical targets and tactical areas of operation, and that's what the whole Skynex and Gepard and similar systems, because Europe had a bunch of these kind of things back in the day with autocannons with radar systems mounted on vehicles. That was a thing back in the Cold War, and the idea was to create umbrellas around the tactical units that needed it. And you kind of need to accept that you're never going to protect an entirety of a front line like the one you have in Ukraine, unfortunately.